fine, I'll try to test out Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, despite the fact that I'm trying to do my ARC B580 review. Everybody in my video today was like, "Win test Indiana Jones." Okay, fine. The caveat to me trying to get my ARC B580 review is that the benchmark scene, I didn't have time to play further into the game. We're going to use the open jungle section of the game at the beginning of the game for the testing, because I just can't dedicate hours to playing deeper into the game because I'm trying to get my ARC B580 review. Now, everybody freaked out because hardware RT required, and that is true. And RTX 4090 getting challenged to need frame generation just to hit 60 FPS, even using DLSS performance. Okay, so I already did a video on the PC system requirements. And again, yes, hardware RT is required. Now, I think that made people scared for two reasons. One, people think of RT and they're like, I'm wasting frames per second. Also, people with AMD hardware are like, oh no, it's gonna run terrible for me. And then there's people on older hardware like, GTX 10 series who are like, the game's not gonna run for me. One of those things is valid. If you're on a GTX 10 series, sorry, that's not hardware RT support. You are out of luck. There is no software fallback. However, if we are going to then go into the, okay, I'm an AMD user, I'm a little bit worried about performance. Well, actually, if you read the system requirements chart, again, as I stated in that video, well, I mean, it's just asking for an RX 6600 to hit 1080p 60 FPS without any upscaling, granted at low settings. Now, I didn't test an RX 6600 in this video, but I did test an RX 7600, so one generation newer, still only 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And by the way, VRAM's a big deal, just like I was speculating when we looked at pairing up things like a 3080 Ti with a 7700 XT. I'm like, those are wildly different other than the 12 gigabytes of VRAM. Anyway, yeah, VRAM's a huge deal in this game. But more on that in a minute. First, let's look at the RX 7600, and we'll go at 1080p medium settings. So 1080p medium settings on the RX 7600, and you can see here that we're hitting around 60 FPS. So RX 7600, AMD hardware, the lowest end of the current generation. We're almost pushing into a next generation. And again, 1080p medium, 60 FPS, and the graphics look pretty good while doing it. No upscaling required. The one thing I will then say, though, is if you're trying to push up to higher graphics, higher resolutions, the VRAM can become a bit of an issue. So if we go to 1440p medium settings, coming from, oops, that's the wrong GPU, sorry. 1440p medium settings from the RX 7600. Here we go. Sorry, I have a whole bunch of folders open with different stuff here. I don't have time to edit this video because I'm doing my ARC B580 review, guys. Anyway, you can see that we're dropping down to around 30 FPS, and there's a lot of signs that it's choking on VRAM. And I can show that that is the case because this RX 7600 has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, but this 7600 XT is only slightly faster. It's like an overclocked 7600 other than the fact that they double the VRAM capacity. And if we go up to 1440p medium on the 7600 XT, now we can see that the game's trying to allocate about 9 gigabytes and the performance numbers are much better. We're around 50 FPS. Sure, it's not a 60 FPS lock, but this is native 1440p. Now, if you wanted to use upscaling, there's a bit of bad news for AMD users. I didn't see any FSR support in the game, or XeSS support for ARC users or AMD users who wanted to use XeSS. Only saw DLSS and then just a temporal, anti-aliasing based upscaler. So if I wanted to, go to a res scale of 66%, which is, the quality setting if you were using FSR and DLSS terminology, I can do that, but it's using just the game's TAA upscaler as opposed to, the name brand FSR. That being said, if I set it to 66% resolution scale, it's equivalent to quality level upscaling, and frame rates are over 60 FPS at medium settings on AMD hardware here with the 7600 XT. Now, that being said, if you were concerned that, NVIDIA is going to perform a lot better because of their ray tracing advantage, the answer is yes. Also, on these edge cases where we're just slightly over 8 gigabytes of VRAM on AMD, as I've seen and talked about in previous videos, it seems like NVIDIA is just slightly more efficient with VRAM usage. And in these edge cases where you're just slightly over 8 on the AMD card, it seems like my NVIDIA card, like the RTX 4060, which is in a similar performance class to these GPUs and price class, is not running into those same issues. So 1440p medium settings on an RTX 4060, which we're looking at here, is running around 60 FPS. Not spilling over the 8GB VRAM issue, which is what we saw, remember, on the 8GB 7600. So, and then if we compare it to the 7600 XT, where we were getting in the low 50s, here we're in the low 60s on the NVIDIA GPU. So yes, performance advantage NVIDIA. It's not absolutely massive, but again, seems like the 4060, at least in this scene, can get away with the 8GB of VRAM at 1440p medium, whereas AMD was having more issues with that. Also, the game does have the DLSS upscaling, which does look better, I think, than the TAA-based upscaler that's built into the game. So here's the RTX 4060 running at 1440p medium, but with DLSS quality. Now we're hitting around 85 FPS through this jungle section of the game. Now, that being said, even the NVIDIA cards do struggle with VRAM when you go beyond the medium settings. So if I tried to play the game at even 1080p resolution, but ultra settings on an RTX 4060, you'll see that initially things seem okay. We're in the mid-50s. But watch this frame time graph. It's going to start getting spikier and spikier and spikier, and the 1% lows dip, and the average and the current frame rate and the average frame rate start to dip. The spikes get worse and worse and worse. And the longer you play, the more your VRAM buffer fills up, the more it's having to spill into system RAM, and the more the game just breaks until by the end of this like 35-second benchmark run, it's an absolute choking mess. So you cannot run 1080p ultra settings on an 8GB NVIDIA card, or AMD card for that matter, and it just in general, 8GB is not enough for the ultra settings, even at 1080p resolution. That being said, the game does warn you that the biggest graphics settings to affect the VRAM buffer is texture settings and shadow settings. And the game does make it very clear that those settings, that when you're choosing settings that go beyond your VRAM pool, and it tells you which settings to turn down. So if we take the game's advice and we use the ultra settings on the RTX 4060 at 1080p, but we specifically turn down the textures and the shadows to medium. So this is textures and shadows at medium. Everything else is the ultra preset. 1080p resolution. You can see now we're up to 85 FPS. So the game's performing well now. And the textures don't actually look terrible, because what the texture setting does in this game is it's the texture cache size. So what you're going to get is more pop-in, especially in the distance or on quick camera cuts, where there'll be a lower resolution texture temporarily, and then it'll try to load in the higher resolution asset once it's available. So in other words, some of your textures will still look just as good as the ultra textures. It's just some of them that haven't streamed in yet are gonna look worse until they pop in the higher res texture. That's basically what happens there. And again, shadow settings turn down a bit there as well for VRAM purposes. Now, so that's kind of the issue there. And then I tried to boot the game at 1440p ultra settings, and I couldn't even get it to boot. This is video. This is not a static image. The game just froze. So there's about 30 seconds of the game's just froze, not loading in on the RTX 4060. So basically, what we've learned so far is the game can run just fine on modest AMD hardware that's not super powerful at ray tracing if you choose appropriate settings. NVIDIA has a bit more power, but again, the 8GB VRAM can be an issue at the higher settings, turn down textures and shadows. What about more powerful GPUs? I did test out the RTX 4070 because that's a 12GB card with a lot more power. Sorry, actually RTX 4070 Super. So the RTX 4070 Super, I can go to 1440p ultra settings, no upscaling. This is no DLSS. This is native 1440p. 100 FPS easy, at least in this scene of the game. Again, that caveat of I was not able to test other locations in the game for the purposes of this video. So 1440p Ultra, no issue on the RTX 4070 Super. So 12GB of VRAM does seem to be enough for that. But the game does have a couple of settings that go beyond Ultra, and those ones can push beyond 12GB of VRAM. So do be careful with that. So for example, if I try to go 1440p Supreme settings, which is what we're looking at here. Actually, I think it stayed within my VRAM buffer. The game warned me it would go beyond, but it didn't for this benchmark pass. But it did warn that it usually would use more than 12 gigabytes, so I think possibly other locations in the game that could cause issues on the Supreme settings. Anyway, but this game also has that big, full path tracing mode. So one thing to keep in mind here is that the full RT mode actually has a variety of quality settings, and that's something to be aware of. There is a few different levels to the path tracing, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So let me clear some of my tabs with all of these other GPUs here. I get way too many video tabs going. Okay, let's look at the RTX 4070 Super trying to run some path tracing. So here is the 1440p Ultra preset as a baseline, but then I've turned on the path tracing, the full RT settings, to the medium setting. It has a medium, a high, and then a true full RT, which is like your fully path trace mode. Well, at medium settings on the path tracing, but ultra settings baseline, with DLSS quality, so this is not native resolution, I am hanging out around 60 FPS. Granted, again, there may be more demanding sections of the game where maybe this would dip a bit, but at least in this area, I am able to stay over 60 FPS using DLSS quality at the lower path tracing setting. If we go into the high path tracing setting, again using ultra settings as the baseline and using DLSS quality, now we're hanging out closer to 50 FPS as opposed to 60 FPS. So you could try a more aggressive upscale. Some people are happy kicking on frame generation here, although we're already pushing into that 12 gigabyte borderline. FrameGen uses even more VRAM, so maybe be a little bit careful on that. And then if we try to go with the full path tracing mode, this is in other words, the maximum settings on the path tracing mode. Now we're dropping to around 30 FPS when we're even using DLSS quality. Now you could push the upscaling even more aggressively, but I'm not sure it's really worth it for the image quality hit that you take. I think this is just a bit much for this GPU. Now, did I try any path tracing on weaker GPUs? Well, I couldn't really do it on the 4060 because we just didn't have the VRAM for it. But I did try the RTX 3060 a bit here. So first of all, let's look at the 3060 a bit without path tracing turned on. So the RTX 3060 can run the ultra settings at 1080p 60 FPS because, again, the 3060 has a 12 gigabyte VRAM buffer. You can see the game's trying to use about 9 or 10 gigabytes of VRAM, allocating 10 per process usage showing around 9. So 1080p normal ultra settings, no issue for the 3060, at least in this scene of the game. And if you did want more performance, again, you could turn settings down a bit from there. For example, I did also test out 1080p high settings on the 3060, and you can see that we get a little more comfortably above 60 FPS, so we have a bit more headroom in case other sections of the game are more demanding. And I did also even test out 1080p medium settings, which were closer to 80 FPS. And on the 3060, I even tested out low settings. So 1080p low settings on the 3060, you can actually get a pretty high refresh rate experience here. We're pushing over 90 FPS. And again, the low settings in this game are actually still looking reasonably good. So if you are on hardware where you're going to be down at the low settings for performance reasons, I don't think you need to feel like the game's going to look absolutely awful or anything like that. So that's good. But what about the other way around? What about trying to go into path tracing modes on the RTX 3060? So this is trying to play at 1080p ultra settings as a baseline with DLSS balanced. So that's a very aggressive upscale for 1080p, but with path tracing settings set to medium, which is actually their lowest path tracing preset. You can see that we can hang out around 30 FPS. However, due to the aggressive upscale, I feel like to my eyes, this looks worse than just playing the game at native 1080p ultra settings without the aggressive upscale and trying to get path tracing going. Now, I did also test out the 3060 at 1440p resolution. At 1440p medium settings, no path tracing, you're a little under 60 FPS, but not by a lot. So 1440p medium might be a reasonable way to play the game on a variable refresh rate display. But I also tested out 1440p medium with DLSS quality, and now we are comfortably over 60 FPS, so if there are other areas of the game that are more demanding, this gives you a bit more headroom. Here we're hanging out around 75 FPS or so in this jungle area. Now, if you wanted to push things more aggressively, this is the ultra settings, but using DLSS quality at 1440p. So 1440p ultra using DLSS quality on an RTX 3060. It's not that beefy of hardware or anything. We are hanging out around 60 FPS. So this game really is fairly well optimized as long as you have appropriate settings for the VRAM capacity of the card, and you're not trying to use path tracing on cards that aren't ridiculously powerful. Speaking of cards that are ridiculously powerful, though, what about this whole business of the RTX 4090 is going to need frame generation to hit 60 FPS, even using DLSS performance? Well, first of all, that's targeting a 4K output. Not everybody is going to be targeting 4K output, so that's one thing. But I'm going to look at 4K and 1440p. Let me close a bunch of these tabs so I can read what the heck I'm doing. So let's get out my 4090 tests. And on the 4090, first let's start without path tracing. So what if you just wanted to play at 4K Ultra? So 4K Ultra settings run at around 100 FPS, and this is not using DLSS, not even DLSS quality. This is a full native 4K resolution, ultra settings, running around 100 frames per second. So it's actually extremely performant. There's a lot of games that do not run at 100 frames per second without upscaling on an RTX 4090 at ultra settings, just to be completely clear. Now, if we engage path tracing, it is going to get significantly more demanding. But I'm also going to test out 1440p, not just 4K resolution. So let's kick on some path tracing. Let's start out at 1440p, and this is going to be the full RT mode for path tracing. Meaning, remember how I said there was three path tracing presets in the game, medium, high, and full RT. This is the full RT at a native 1440p resolution, no upscaling. We're hanging out at around 50-ish FPS in this scene of the game. It's completely playable, although I think somebody on a 4090 is probably targeting higher than 50 FPS. So if I had a 4090 playing at 1440p and I wanted to use the full RT mode, I'd probably kick on DLSS quality. DLSS quality at a 1440p output looks pretty good, and it boosts our frame rate close to 80 FPS in this scene. So completely maxed out path tracing, 1440p output with DLSS quality, upscaling, hanging out in the upper 70 FPS range. So seems pretty good. Again, other areas of the game might be more demanding, but yeah, definitely have some headroom there to stay above 60. Now, what if we wanted to do 4K native rendering resolution in the full RT mode? Not in the medium, not the high, the full RT maxed out path tracing. Well, we're around 30 FPS, but that is native 4K resolution, which in general is probably not optimal. Using DLSS quality is usually a better idea. You get a lot of performance, and at a 4K output looks very good. And especially if you're trying to use a path tracing mode. Trying to do it at native 4K resolution is kind of just being stubborn. So if we kick on DLSS quality, we do get a lot of performance. Now, we don't get to 60 FPS. We get to, lower 50s or so. So if we're hanging out in the kind of the upper 40s, lower 50s, DLSS quality in the absolutely maxed out path tracing mode on the 4090, I mean, it doesn't feel amazing, but it's not out of line with other path tracing games like Cyberpunk's RT Overdrive mode or Alan Wake 2's full path tracing mode, full RT mode. But what if we went to DLSS performance? Well, if I go to performance mode DLSS, we do go to around 60 FPS. But again, remember how I said this is just randomly testing out the intro area of this game. I'm fairly confident that there are going to be areas of this game that happen to be more demanding than this initial forest area. So if you got much more demanding than this, you would fall below 60 FPS, even with DLSS performance in the full RT mode on the RTX 4090, and that would explain the claim that they were using frame gen as well as DLSS performance for that 60 FPS. And I think that the 60 FPS is more like they're going to be, system requirements charts are generally, they either say 30 or 60. And they say 30 if you're not to 60. And they say, but they might say 60, but really you're over 60. Like you're not dipping below 60. So it's that kind of a thing. All right, I tested out a bunch of GPUs for you in today's video. I tested out another one, but I'm not allowed to show it to you yet. And I need to get back to the B580 review, guys. But I hope you guys found this video useful and or interesting. My overall thoughts is pretty much what I thought based on the system requirements, which is that actually this is pretty optimized. Although, yeah, if you don't have a hardware RT capable hardware, that is disappointing if you wanted to play this game, because otherwise it is pretty performant. But GPUs without hardware RT support are pretty old at this point. If you're trying to play the latest AAA games, I don't think it's completely unreasonable to expect to have to upgrade your GPU if you bought it, going on, 8 years ago for the 10 series, something like that. It's either 6 or 8, but either way, it's a while ago now. Still doesn't feel great if you're left out, though, and I totally get that. Again, if you were worried about AMD hardware not being able to run the game, again, I tried out some pretty modest AMD hardware, and we could still play the game over 60 FPS at settings that looked pretty good. The main thing you need to keep your eye on in this game is the VRAM amounts, and the game does a good job of warning you about that, and does a good job of telling you exactly which settings to turn down. Don't be afraid to keep other settings pretty high and just turn down the texture settings and the shadow settings until your performance improves if it's VRAM related. I have absolutely no issue with games offering a forward-looking mode that challenges the latest and greatest hardware. And maybe you'd want to revisit in the future when GPUs are more powerful or GPUs of this power level are less expensive. I think it's totally fine to include modes like this as long as you can play the game at settings that look good on reasonable hardware that doesn't cost an arm and a leg. And it looks like we're definitely there. So overall, that's my thoughts. Like I said, I got to get back to the B580 review. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video and have an excellent day.